South Africa was by no means an inevitable outcome. There was a very real risk that the country would stumble down the path of bloody and prolonged conflict, as has been the experience of so many nations struggling to overcome internal divisions. With the eyes of the world on this country, the people of South Africa initiated the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, ensuring revenge and violence in favor of truth and forgiveness, and ultimately the reconstruction of our country. As a result, South Africa today stands as a model of merciful justice, of what can be achieved when enemies choose dialogue over violence. I think this excerpt really contextualizes how close South Africa was to be on the brink of a civil war post-apartheid, or just at the end of the apartheid era. Beyond highlighting the status of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a global model of transitional justice, the PowerPoint, sorry, not the document. That one, thank you. Thank you. The excerpt that I read out points. Next slide. Thank you. Points to the difficult context in which the Commission was established and the compromises and the heroic discourse that enabled the country's transitional moment to occur. The next slide, please. What I wanted to do was, I'm not going to go into complete detail about the history of the mandate and the setup of the TRC, but just briefly, our TRC was established in 1995 through an act of the South African Parliament, the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act, which was referred to October 1998. Our final report came out in March of 2003. The mandate was really to promote national unity and reconciliation by restoring the human and civil dignity of victims, by recommending reparation. The TRC was comprised of 3 committees. The first one was the Human Rights Violations Committee, the Amnesty Committee, and the Reparations and Rehabilitation Committee. In total, we had 17 commissioners that served our commission. All of them were South African nationals, ranging from academics, law practitioners, judges, social practitioners. We had a range of expertise on the commission. We had 6 institutional hearings with, for example, the business and labor sector, with faith communities, with the legal community, with the health sector, with the media, and with prisons. We had also 3 special hearings that focused on compulsory military service, children and youth, and we had a special hearing for women. The more specific aims of recording the testimony of the victims, granting reparations and amnesty, and the stipulations of the final report are embodied in the workings of the committees of the TRC. So let me take you through the TRC committees. The first one that I'll be speaking to is the Human Rights Violations Committee in 1994. More than 50 public hearings were held, spanning a total of 244 days. The Commission received more than 21,000 statements from individuals. Estimated 10% of the 21,000 statements, which is 2,100 approximately, were taken in front of the Commission to be heard publicly. The Reparations and the Rehabilitation Committee, they were charged with restoring victims' dignity and formulating proposals to assist with rehabilitation. Now, this committee was the only one of the 3 TRC committees that did not hold public hearings. Rather, based on evidence presented to the TRC, it was, according to the TRC Act, to put forward recommendations for a comprehensive reparations policy for those found to be victims. And when I speak about victims, we're speaking about direct and indirect victims. And indirect victims would be your family members, your spouses of direct victims of gross human rights violations during the period that the TRC was investigating. The government was responsible for implementing these recommendations and the reparations policy. Other recommendations aimed at preventing the reoccurrence of abuses were also to be legislated for in the TRC's final report. It was intended that the information made available through the TRC process would assist in providing an undisputed historical record, and thorough documentation of the violations that occurred during the apartheid times. The last committee, which is the Amnesty Committee, considered applications from individuals who had applied for amnesty in accordance to the provisions of the TRC Act. So in our country, created with a political objective committed in the course of the conflicts of the past. The individual must not have been acting in his lane or through personal malice, ill will, or spite. Rather, individuals must have been members of a publicly known political party or an employee of the state who on reasonable grounds believed that he or she was acting in the course and scope of his express or implied authority. Next slide. Where are you? No. Go back. Go back. There we go. Stop. By the end, I think you're jumping here. I'm not done yet. By the end of the Commission's lifespan, just in summary, 21,000 people had come forward, men and women, young and old, and came to the Commission and spoke about 38,000 counts of violations of gross human rights. In the process, the broad outlines of the past emerged with undeniable clarity. 90% of those who had come forward to testify were black South Africans. Most of them were women that came forward to testify. I don't know if anybody was able to, during the time when the hearings were publicly displayed on all the channels, BBC, CNN, there was a lot of women in those sessions. But what was very unique about the fact that there were women there was that they were not there to talk about their own violations. They came to testify on behalf of dead husbands, dead sons, dead fathers. They were coming to tell a story on behalf of somebody else. Next slide. Thank you. So, all in all, the TRC had two clear agendas. They had an accountability agenda and they had a reconciliation agenda. And the tension really was around how to find balance between these two agendas to ensure that the rights of victims were upheld and that they were obtaining or achieving the objectives of the TRC. So in terms of the accountability agenda, the TRC had an implicit approach to accountability. Their understanding was that eliciting the truth of apartheid-era violations would give rise to accountability along with reconciliation, both individually and collectively. The TRC had aimed to ensure individual accountability through the disclosure of perpetrators' crimes and identities, along with the public shaming and naming, and promise of apology that this would entail, as well as the eventual prosecutions of perpetrators who did not apply for amnesty based on evidence gathered during the proceedings of the Commission. Collective accountability would rest largely on. This would be linked to the TRC's work of drawing a very bright line between the past and the present by underlining the apartheid state's accountability for these violations. Its most overt efforts at promoting collective accountability were done through the 2 to 3 day institutional hearings held to explore the depth of collaboration with the apartheid regime of institutions or groups as diverse as the business and labor divisions, the legal profession, the health sector, media, religious communities, political parties, prisons, and the armed force, which is our army. In terms of state accountability, the TRC's aim of highlighting the accountability of the apartheid state was apparent throughout the process of the Commission and manifested in the final report's strong condemnation of the former regime and its systemic violations in and beyond South Africa. The TRC also underlines state accountability through its recommendations for reparations to victims, which obligations by law rested with the new government. This acknowledgement of victims' suffering pointed to both collective and state accountability, particularly as part of the government's budget funded by taxpayers. Now, next slide. Just to evaluate what has happened to date in terms of this agenda of accountability. In terms of individual accountability, to date, the TRC had received 7,116 applications for amnesty, of which only 20% included details of gross human rights violations, such as killings and torture, and thus were heard publicly during the Commission sessions. Of these 7,000 and odd applications, 362 applicants were denied amnesty, while 1,167 were granted full amnesty, and 145 were granted conditional amnesty for some and not all of the acts that they committed. Furthermore, fewer than 300 of these applicants who appeared before the Commission were members of the apartheid security forces, and nearly all of these were low or mid-ranking functionaries. And what this meant was that the key role players that enforced apartheid in South Africa, so for example, your top-level executives, the president, members of the ministry, the ministers, none of them participated within the TRC process. So none of them could be held directly accountable for what had actually happened as being a direct perpetrator. As regards to individual apologies, a number of amnesty applicants did request to meet with victims and their families, either to acknowledge victim suffering or really apologize for their crimes. While these efforts were very important, it became clear that victims were largely ambivalent about such attempts during the TRC process, so they were not really aware that there was this option to meet the perpetrator or the person that committed the violations. And in some instances, offers of apology turned out to be last-minute attempts by the perpetrators to stop or halt prosecutions against them. While the threat of prosecutions was used by the TRC, few trials dealing with apartheid-era violations have occurred, and even fewer have been successful. The TRC handed over 300 files to the National Prosecuting Authority of our country with evidence it perceived to be substantial enough to warrant further investigation and trials. The National Prosecuting Authority established a priority crimes litigation unit in their department in 2003 to prosecute these high-level crimes. However, none has happened. What they have done is that in 2007, they announced a new strategy that gave this unit full discretion to grant offenders immunity from prosecution, which in actual fact amounts to de facto amnesty. This policy was challenged in court and eventually ruled to be unconstitutional. Even without this official policy, the National Prosecuting Authority has chosen to pursue only a handful of apartheid-related prosecutions since the end of the TRC. In addition, in 2002, our then President Thabo Mbeki exercised his presidential right to pardon 33 individual prisoners who were prisoners for allegedly committing crimes with political motives, all of whom were denied amnesty during the TRC. So he had granted amnesty to these 33 people. In 2007, again, Mbeki initiated a special dispensation process that allowed individuals who had not approached the TRC for amnesty, but were in prison for politically motivated crimes committed before 1999 to apply for pardon. This de facto amnesty was challenged by a coalition of civil society organizations called the South African Coalition on Transitional Justice. The CSVR is a part of this coalition. We took the President and the Ministry to court, to the Constitutional Court, and on the basis that this whole process was not transparent and violated victims' rights to participate in the process. Our claim was successfully upheld by the Constitutional Court in 2010, and we were able to stop the President from exercising that right. In terms of state accountability, besides questions regarding the democratic state's broader accountability to citizens, questions have been raised concerning the state's commitment to the TRC's accountability agenda since the Commission closed. These particularly concern the state's attitude towards its obligation to provide reparations for victims, the most overt, ongoing expression of state accountability. The South African Coalition for Transitional Justice has been advocating for better individual reparations that would benefit a larger group of victims, as many did not have the opportunity to register with the TRC. In addition to provisions for collective reparations, specifically with the more than 1 billion rand, that's close to $10 million, that remains in the fund, the President's Fund, that is the reparation fund that exists in our government, that was earmarked for reparations. The government has been very unresponsive to these efforts. Indeed, recently, last year, actually in November, the government promulgated a bill in front of Parliament with a plan to use the President's Fund to implement collective reparations in our country in 18 We don't actually know how they even chose the areas or the communities that they want to implement these collective reparations in, but they chose 18 small cities throughout South Africa, and this whole process was done with no consultations with victims, no consultations with civil society. I think that they're just trying to get rid of the money. Anyway, the next, thank you. In terms of the reconciliation agenda of the Commission, it apartheid and prompt self-reflection and attitudinal changes in the South African public. Reconciliation was never clearly defined by the Commission, just as it was not defined in our Constitution or the TRC Act. The TRC's notion of individuals suggested that by telling their stories through private testimonies and public hearings, hearing the truth from perpetrators, receiving that public acknowledgement of their suffering and obtaining symbolic and material reparations from the state, victims of apartheid-era violations would receive a degree of closure regarding their trauma and their loss, which would enable them to begin the process of healing. What they were trying to assert was, there was a slogan that kept flying up and down on placards during the Commission sessions, was revealing is healing. That was the assumption. Individual reconciliation was therefore intimately linked with national reconciliation, particularly among the different race groups that exist in South Africa, that would allow for the divided society to move on together. The collective reconciliation intended by the TRC was based on the notion that by generating an authoritative record of the past, official truth-telling mechanisms shift responsibility for past crimes from an identity group to individual perpetrators, creating a common public memory that impedes the divisive rhetoric on past events, opens new spaces for constructive discussion of the past, and in fact gives citizens permission to move on. And in South Africa, this whole nation of the Rainbow Nation was born. Now, to date, reconciliation, the agenda relied on ongoing follow-ups from the state and other entities. And when I say the Commission's own aims regarding reconciliation appear mostly to have been attitude changes through the humanization of individuals belonging to the other groups, and it kind of would contribute to the newly legitimized state's nation-building efforts. The TRC certainly succeeded in legitimizing the new government and in generating a powerful discourse that enshrined reconciliation and mutual forgiveness, and feeding the post-transition state's claims of building a rainbow nation. Collective reconciliation in our country has been fairly shallow to date. It has been argued that the main beneficiaries of apartheid, and I'm talking about the white minority population of our country, do not question their privilege, having retreated to a comfortable position of personal non-culpability, and perceiving reconciliation to mean that the black majority of our population must just forget about what had happened in South Africa and they need to move on now. Something that's quite interesting that happened in our country, that happened last year actually, was that a campaign was launched in South Africa last year called Red October. Red October was launched in September 2013, calling for an end to the oppression of and the violence against white people in South Africa, and focused on the alleged corruption of the government and injustice of its black economic empowerment and affirmative action policies, as well as the killing of white people, particularly farm owners. Now, this campaign was centered on several cities in South Africa and a few abroad. And the campaign really consisted mostly of the Afrikaans-speaking base of communities in South Africa. While it was met usually with a dismissive sort of attitude by society and by the media, what was concerning was that this campaign attracted more than 12,000 followers on Facebook. Over 22,000 people signed supporting this petition, claiming that white people are being direct victims of reverse apartheid in our country. From this viewpoint, the TRC may have succeeded in giving South Africans permission to move on, but not necessarily in raising awareness of collective accountability, specifically among beneficiaries and its relationship to reconciliation. One reason for this may be that, as noted above, the TRC focused on individual civil and political rights violations, which brought public attention to the acts of a very few bad apples in the apartheid era, as opposed to the apartheid state's systemic political and socio-economic oppression and the way it was carried out and supported at all levels of society during the apartheid times. Carry on, thank you. 2014 today, it's actually the anniversary, it's of May. And already, I think it was the other night, I was looking at, watching CNN, and there was a scene in Johannesburg of the two opposing leading political parties, the African National Congress and the Democratic Alliance. The supporters met the DA supporters head on, and terrible violence ensued. It looked like a scene from the 1960 Sharpeville massacre, where police were firing rubber bullets on our people, and this is currently happening. So the unrest, the political dramas are all unfolding right now in South Africa. We have to acknowledge, though, that yes, there have been some serious and good improvements in our country. Apartheid has been abolished. People have a lot more access to socioeconomic rights. Improvements have been made to access to education, health services. There's been a small dent in poverty. I wouldn't even call it a dent, but there's been some changes in poverty in our country. Government has started rolling out services such as piped water and electricity into rural areas. But we cannot ignore that the economic inclusion of the majority of the black people has not taken place. We cannot ignore that the stock exchange today reflects the continued concentration of economic power in white hands. It is estimated that the black majority owns less than 10% of the stock exchange in our country. Inequality is extremely rife in our country. The divisions between the rich and the poor, it's huge. The nature and the level of violence has transformed in South Africa, and it is at an all-time high. We have been looking at, and I'm sure some people have seen, terrible media images of police facing off with protesters. Marikana is a prime example. The country is being rocked by waves of strike action, and there are ongoing service delivery protests. And these protests, really, they range from your basic bread and butter issues, where people are begging for decent toilets in Cape Town, to the demand for the return of land and the nationalization of our mines. Thank you. I mean, all in all, I think we're just trying to reflect on what has happened in the last 20 years. And just thinking through, I think just sitting in the last 2 days, sitting in the hearing and with my very minimal understanding of French, trying to conclude or trying to assimilate what people are asking for, I had some thoughts around the Togolese process. And this is just something that I'd like to share. Truth commissions, really, they're temporary bodies mandated to clarify and acknowledge the truth about past human rights violations that occurred in the country. Looking at the scope and the mandate of your Truth Commission, like many other Truth Commissions in Togo, your commission was mandated with objectives beyond truth finding. It is important to remember that the mandate of the commission and the commissioners, they've ended. So it will be unfair to have any further unreasonable expectations from them, as they have no longer a legal standing in your country. Their work has ended. The rest of the country now needs to stand together, step up with government, and start implementing the recommendations that the Commission has drafted. The Commission's role has ended. In terms of your amnesty process, it really should be enacted and designed to create institutional and security conditions for the sustainable protection of human rights, and would require the individual offenders to engage with measures that would ensure truth and accountability and reparations for victims. The concept of reconciliation. I think yesterday the debate was quite interesting, and it's a very sensitive topic. Reconciliation is very sensitive. The idea of reconciliation is very personal. And I think we can all agree that reconciliation is extremely complex. It's both a goal that your country is trying to achieve, and it's a process which includes truth, justice, and healing at the most basic level. It's important to remember that reconciliation is not an excuse for impunity or a substitute for the truth. Reparations is another very important and sensitive issue that your country is trying to deal with. The whole issue around distributing reparations is a very sensitive and important matter. Where do you start? Thank you for the time. Where do you start? Who do you give reparations to? Who qualifies as a victim? These were all questions that South Africa faced that we did not answer. And my recommendation really is that you sit with these questions and answer them for yourselves before you even start trying to implement reparations in this country. Many factors need to be considered. It would be very imperative that the Togolese government, with the assistance of civil society, with the victims and all other important stakeholders, develop a satisfactory reparations program to be implemented for this country. What's also very important is there seems to be difficulty in retaining public and political support. And that I can draw from the South African example. We are 20 years on into our democracy. Our government seems to have forgotten that there are recommendations that they need to implement. So the legitimacy of the Truth Commission, the acceptance of its findings, the prospects of implementing these recommendations all rest on broad public and political support. Everybody needs to support the process for its successful implementation. Media will play a very big role in generating public awareness around this. The question around the final report that was handed over by the Commission. The final report of a Truth Commission is one of its most enduring legacies, the preparation of society and to victims. The reach of the report needs to extend beyond the political, academic and professional audience. There is a need to publish a simplified and shortened. Yesterday I couldn't really read it, it was in French. There is a shortened, very comprehensive version of the very first volume that was released. I think it's also time that civil society and all relevant stakeholders formally and publicly request that the government provide a written response to the status of the recommendations and the final reports. It would be suggested that the government presents its recommendations to Parliament, either through a debate and holding public consultations with victims and civil society. And just some conclusion and final thoughts. Somebody's flagging there's no more minutes left to speak. But the field of transitional justice is growing at a very rapid rate. And while truth commissions are still the main model being touted by international agencies, new governments and many civil society actors, there is a growing recognition that truth commissions, it's not a cure-all solution. Truth-seeking or truth-finding is a vital point in the trajectory of a society, but it is important to acknowledge the element as being one phase of a longer-term process of societal recovery and reinvention. The South African Truth Commission was not the magical solution to the problems facing South Africa. We still have a very long road to travel. We've been on it for 20 years. We don't have all the answers, and we are not the successful model that other countries need to base their frameworks on. Somebody asked me yesterday, so after I said that, so do you think South Africa should have had a Truth Commission? I said yes. It was the right thing to have happened at that time. I do agree that it was very inspirational in the creativity demonstrated in the face of all the challenges that face many other similar societies. Today, still, civil society is constantly reminding government that unless high levels of poverty and inequality are addressed in our country, South Africa, a successful TRC legacy and a true reconciliation will evade us all as South Africans. And it's time that our government starts dealing with the unfinished business of the past, being the TRC. And I think just another conclusion is that there are many countries going through transition in South Africa, in Africa itself. And I think Togo and the Togolese government and civil society needs to be very sensitive as to how they portray their needs and their objectives. And they need to be clear that a one-size-fits-all does not work. It will not work for Togo. You need to look at the unique situation that your country is finding itself in. And be honest with yourself as a country, be honest with what it is that you can achieve. And inshallah, you need to be sure about the fact that it's a very long process, and hopefully that is what you people can demonstrate throughout your transition right now. Thank you.